Hi, I'm Tim. Welcome to Watchbox, and thanks for logging on. Today we have a shootout between an upstart and the establishment. It's the Moser Cie Streamliner Center Second versus the Audemars Piguet Royal Oak self-winding. Let the games begin. We will begin with the watch that's probably the better known, and which by one model year was first to market. Now, of course, the Royal Oak's been around since 1972. It is an institution in luxury horology, arguably the first super premium sports watch. The Royal Oak has been through many iterations and many references. This one launched at SIHH 2019. It is the reference 15500 ST. Now, there are a couple of different dial variants available, of which this gray is perhaps the most handsomely monochromatic and contemporary. Now, the watch in stainless steel measures 41 millimeters, as the mainstream automatic Royal Oaks have been since 2012. In terms of thickness, it's 10.1 millimeters. It's 50.2 millimeters from lug to lug. We'll get a little bit closer for a better view. And then if you measure these plots outboard, these little intermediate links, the total distance across the wrist is 52.4. Now, thrown on my 16 centimeter circumference wrist, you can see that whatever the nominal size, and Audemars Piguet calls this a 41, it wears a lot larger than that. Across my wrist, I'd say it wears more like a 43, to be perfectly honest. It's not thick, it's quite flat, it fits easily underneath the cuff, but really your wrist needs to be 15 centimeters circumference or larger to wear this one well, as it is right out to the edge of my wrist when you count the intermediate links on the side. We'll zoom out a bit so you can get a better sense in relation to the size of my arm. It's not oversized, not by any means, but I am approaching the limit of what would look good and feel right. Now, the timepiece is beautifully hand finished, and this has been the case with the Royal Oaks since time immemorial. To be more precise, 1972. It takes about 9 to 11 hours to hand finish these bracelets in steel, and so part of the price of the admission with this watch is the finishing outside the case, not just inside with the movement. The case is finished to the same degree. As you can see, the character line from the bezel down through the mid-case through the case back continued and perfectly aligned. Breaks between polish and satin. The case and the bezel take just as much time to finish as the bracelet, and as you can see, the bracelet is beautifully made with a perfect bevel that runs from the shoulders of the lugs all the way down the flanking links, and these little polished ends to the intermediate links that you can really only see when you roll the bracelet through the light. Speaking to the attention to detail, things are being finished where you can barely see them. The bracelet is held in place by screw-fixed removable links, so you do have quite a bit of sizing flexibility at home. You can do this yourself with a screwdriver. Then we have a sequential closed twin trigger clasp that's quite robust. It feels solid enough to be on an offshore, and you can see it's a combination of media blasting and satin internally. The bracelet is held to the case using screws and bars, which is a big advantage as it is more secure than a spring bar setup. The crown is a screw down. The watch is 50 meters water resistant, which makes it surface swimmable with a screw down crown. You can see the crown is hexagonal to match the hexagonal white gold bolts inside the bezel. The bezel, since 1972, inspired by a vintage diving helmet. And then the dial, a hobnail. This is the Grande Tapisserie. It is the larger of the two hobnails. The 15202 has the petite. This one, still cut on a pantograph lathe, has been made in-house at AP since 2012. They use a mimicry engine that takes a large template and then duplicates the pattern on a smaller template, which becomes the dial. It's then galvanized gray like you see here. We have a date that is gray to match the dial, and then applique, indices, hands, and AP logo. It is a clear but grayscale look. The timepiece is easy to read and somewhat understated. Now that might be an advantage or a disadvantage based on your preference. You might want a brighter silver dial or warmer blue dial, but the bottom line is that this dial has proven to be quite the crowd pleaser, as just about everyone has found it agreeable. A timepiece that is thin and quite a bit thinner than the Moser, 10.1 millimeters thick, and it gives way to a case back featuring a movement that was new for 2019, the 4302 automatic winding 70-hour power reserve, 32 joules. It still has a full balance bridge and a free sprung index like the old 3120, but it gets the extra 10 hours of power reserve up to 70, and it beats now at 8 beats per second rather than the previous 6, meaning it has a little bit more potential accuracy, especially in the face of bumps or concussions on the wrist. It also fills the case back better than the old 3120, and it has a similarly rugged architecture, being thin but not too thin, and robust with a view to use in both the Royal Oak and the offshore. And we have ceramic rotor bearing balls for high efficiency and minimum maintenance requirements. Of course, we have hacking seconds and a quick set date function. Now, the Upstart. This is a model that was only launched in 2020. In fact, the whole Streamliner collection from Moser was only launched in 2020. They came out with a flyback, and then they came out with this, the Center Seconds. Now, this watch has slightly more compact dimensions in some regards, in others not so much. So the timepiece measures 40 millimeters in diameter by 11.7 millimeters thick, and if you were to measure it from side to side, you actually include the rigid-most outcropping of the flanking links. It's about 48 millimeters across the wrist. And on paper, it might sound like this is a much smaller watch, and to be honest, it is. Throwing it on my wrist, I have to say, it feels nowhere near the boundary-pushing scope of the Royal Oak. The Royal Oak in 41 millimeters seems like a junior offshore, which is difficult to wear, especially if you're counting on a 41 millimeter watch, but when you wear this, I'd say it feels more like a 39. As you can see, the bracelet starts to curve down and around my wrist almost immediately, and from the top, you can see that the lugs of the watch come nowhere near the edge of my wrist. I really think down to a wrist size of 13.5 centimeters circumference, you can wear this one fairly well, and while it is thicker, there's nothing particularly offensive about the case band that would cause a dress sleeve to get hung up. It does have a little bit of slope to the bezel too, so I think you could wear this with formal attire. Sometimes I consider a thickness advantage to be a big advantage in these comparisons. It's more academic here between these two watches. Now, taking a look at the bracelet, we need to address the styling inspirations for this watch. Everything from some of the more, I would say, tonneau profiled Speedmaster Mark series, to the Oris Chronoris Star, another tonneau watch from the 70s, to perhaps the Ebel Sport Classic from the period. That's probably a bracelet reference. And there's a little bit of the Omega Speed Sonic Chronograph Lobster Tail in the sort of organic chainmail profile of these links. What's unarguable is that Moser did what almost everyone from Vempe to Chopard failed to do, which is create a 70s tribute look that draws from the style of the period without plagiarizing a specific watch. This does not look like a Gerald Genta knockoff, even though with its lapping machine, radial grain, and its integration of tonneau case with bracelet, it really does feel like a product of the 70s. But grip it in the hand and you can tell it's a product of the modern era, as the tolerances between these links are incredible. Note there's no daylight showing. This is seamless. There's absolutely no gapping between the links, and yet it's set up, and I can attest to this, so that it will not pinch scare or pinch skin or pull your wrist hairs. It's just a very, very smooth, supple, and again, almost organic form. It's almost like a segmented armored creature on the seafloor in ancient times. It is just beautiful, flowing, and supple, and it has removable links that are small in cross-section and many in number, so you're going to be able to size this quite precisely. Now, the one advantage the Royal Oak has is that these are pin sleeve fixed links, so you're going to need a block and a punch to size this, but that's not very difficult to do. You just need to know ahead of time. You're not going to be able to size it with a screwdriver. We have another twin trigger, double folding clasp. I do think the AP's is a little bit more solid in feel and substantial. The gauge of the metal is definitely thicker, but both of them work equally well. The timepiece includes evacuated flanks, and this is a Moser signature. Just about every modern Moser watch will have some sort of scalloped profile or evacuated profile in its caseband. Here we have a little bit of a sandwich construction with a recessed satination in between two polished ends, the caseback and the bezel, and then we have that radial satin grain, that lapping machine pattern that is distinctive of many 70s watches. We have a double knurled Moser logo screw-down crown here. We're 120 meters water resistant, which is far more than the AP. This is a very swimmable watch for everything but diving. As you can see, the dial is also inspired by the era, as we have this sort of staggered track, these staggered hash marks outboard, often known as the racing dial because of their application on a lot of chronographs from the 1970s, and they do look a little bit like a checkered flag. They give you that period feel, but like everything else on the dial, it's designed to work in concert with a modern paradigm. This is not designed to be explicitly a retro watch, and I should probably wind my watches before these shows. Now, the timepiece has a caliber HMC 200 inside, and it's a no-date movement. It does, however, feature hacking or stop seconds. Whether you want the date or don't want the date will determine whether or not you think the no-date feature of the dial is an advantage or disadvantage. What I can tell you is that the applique indices are beautifully symmetrical, matching the aspect ratio as well as profile of the ceramic loom material as well as the underlying black polished hands. So that same form is echoed in the indices, the dollop of loom, and the shape of the hands. The watch does have loom. May as well do a loom shot of both of them here. As you can see on the Moser, we have loomed hands, whereas on the AP we have loomed hands and indices. So from a loom perspective, the AP does have the advantage, even if the loom plots on the hands of the Moser are larger. That said, there's a lot more going on the Moser dial besides hands and indices, as we have a lovely fume sunburst. The sunburst is the radial grain emanating out from the center. Moser calls this matrix green, and you can see the fume is the fade from light at the center to dark at the edge. It's distinctive of the brand, and I'm going to go out on a limb and say even if I were to cover up that logo, you would know who made this dial, or at least what brand issued this dial. The movement is a handsome piece, HMC 200, like the 4302 in the AP. It's a combination of hand finishing and machine finishing that looks its price and properly fills its case size. So the movement is an automatic winder with a pawl-based magic lever type system. Like the AP, it has a full balance bridge with a free-sprung index for shock tolerance, and it's fairly thick to better withstand the concussions that a sports watch base movement will encounter. It does beat at a slower beat rate, though, 21,600 vibrations per hour, so at least in theory, the AP could be a little bit more accurate, especially when vibrations and shakes on the wrist are factored in. That's where a higher beat movement generally gives you a little bit of an accuracy advantage. Now, talking about the advantages of these watches vis-a-vis each other, we should mention that the AP is thinner. I don't think it makes a big difference between these two watches, but for some, thinner will always be better, and although the AP still wears larger, it's undeniable this one sits lower on the wrist. I would also say loom. You just saw it. The AP's fully loomed dial is just easier to read at night. Longevity and heritage. I love the design of this watch, and I love that it draws effectively on the tropes of the 70s, but the reality is that this watch is immediately identifiable as the watch that came out in 1972. That kind of staying power, that status as an all-time great, immunity to planned obsolescence or obsolescence of any kind, that is a huge advantage for any Royal Oak. I like the date. I think it is useful. When I have it on a watch, I use it. When I don't, I miss it. So we have the date here, and we have a higher beat rate, which at least in theory means the AP could be a little bit more accurate over time. The bracelet construction and clasp. This bracelet, while not quite as beautifully delicate or organic, does feel substantial, almost like it was destined for an offshore. And then the removable links are fixed by screws, which I prefer by far to pin sleeve sizing. And then we have a clasp that is very solid. Once again, I feel like invoking the name of the offshore here, as this clasp seems as though it could be transferred directly to the offshore and it would be right at home, appropriate to the bulk of that watch, certainly to this one. Also important to mention, there are some strap options from Audemars Piguet and the aftermarket. If you want to dress this up with a different look, strap, rubber, textile, leather, you're going to have no problem getting that, whereas there are currently no such options for the Streamliner. And this is a watch that can be purchased from an AP boutique or premier retailer with a 5-year warranty, whereas the Moser is still strictly a 2-year warranty. So on a warranty basis, advantage Audemars Piguet. Now, the Moser. Speaking of the advantage here, the prices, we should mention them. New or used, the Moser has the advantage, as this is a watch that used costs $21,500 US, or I should say new $21,500 US, and used costs about $25,000 to $27,000. So for under 22 grand, you're going to get into one of these, and even if you pay the pre-owned markup to get one immediately without a wait, you're going to be well under $30,000. Whereas here, we have a watch that costs $23,900 new. Good luck getting it at that price. Big wait lists, short supply, and used, it's about $48,000 to $50,000. So on a price basis, new or used, this is the one you're going to want to get. And it's almost to the point where you could easily get 2 of these for the price of the AP and still have money left over. So advantage Moser. I would also say, realistically, the no date dial here works. While I like the date, I do think that this color and the ambiance of the fume fade, the balance of this dial, works best without a hole punched. So one of the rare cases where I actually do think the no date dial is a greater success and more desirable. Water resistance, 120, 50, 120. It's not even close. This is a much safer watch to have in and around Aqua. Okay, better fit, at least for me. This is a watch where even if you were to measure the most extreme outcropping of the links across the wrist, you measure it 2 links down, it's about 48 millimeters. Measure it all the way out, and it's 50. Still, 50.8 compares to 52.4 across the wrist for the Royal Oak. So this watch is the easier one to wear on the wrist, despite being a little bit thicker. It is more compact and fits better. And I would also remind you that rarity is in this watch's favor, though this is possibly the tougher watch to come by new right now. There are still a lot more 15500s in the world in circulation than there are Streamliner center seconds, and I'll add, there are a hell of a lot more Royal Oaks than Streamliners of all descriptions. This is the timepiece I would pick. It's colorful, it's cheerful, it innovates. It takes new ideas, or at the very least, it takes old ideas we haven't seen in a long time and implements them in a modern package. I like the way it looks, I like the way it fits, and I like the fact that Moser's only making 1,500 watches of all descriptions each year, whereas AP's probably making about 60,000. So on the basis of price, rarity, innovation, color, and character, I pick the Streamliner center second, though you might pick the Audemars on the basis of history and heritage. Let me know in the description below, which of these would you pick for your own wrist? Time out, Tim out, and thanks for logging on.